Hello everybody, this is Angela. Welcome to my channel. Welcome back to my channel. Please hit like and subscribe to my channel. Please hit the notification bell so you'll know when I come up with a new video. And we're going to read from Who Was Helen Keller? Chapter 6. Years at Perkins. From Washington, D.C., Annie and Helen made their way by train to Boston. At Perkins, Helen met the now middle-aged Laura Bridgman. The meeting was a disappointment. However, Laura thought that Helen was too much of a tomboy. Helen sat on the floor. Laura did not approve of that. When Helen left, she bent to kiss Laura goodbye and stepped on Laura's toes. Laura cried out in pain. Helen felt like a clumsy schoolgirl. Some people thought that Helen was too loud and laughed too much. But Annie did not agree. She knew that Helen was full of life. Annie wanted Helen to grab hold of life and not wait quietly for things to happen. Helen spoke at the Perkins commencement. This was an important event. The Boston newspapers ran stories about the school and the children who graduated from it. Important and rich people came to this event. The governor of Massachusetts was there. The band played. 10 boys showed how well they could do arithmetic. Then came Helen. Helen had been sitting patiently on the platform waiting for her turn. She smiled and glowed as she waited. She could feel the crowd's energy proudly. Helen spelled a poem about birds into Annie's hand. Annie spoke the words as Helen spelled. The audience was spellbound. When the school closed for the summer, Annie and Helen went to Cape Cod for the first time. Helen went swimming in the ocean. She loved the feel of the cold salt water on her face. Cape Cod was to become Helen's most favorite place. One day when Helen was swimming, the strong waves pulled her under. She fought her way to the surface, swallowing water as she struggled. The waves tossed her onto the sand. Helen lay there in terror, not sure what happened. Annie ran to her and hugged her and comforted her. Helen had courage. 2 days later, she went back in the ocean swimming. Helen had only one question. Who, she wanted to know, had filled the ocean with salt. After Annie and Helen went home to Alabama, lessons and learning again filled their days. As time passed, Annie thought about leaving Alabama. The local people stared at Annie and Helen when they went into town. Annie believed that Helen could learn more by living in the city, so Annie asked the Kellers to let them both live at Perkins. Reluctantly, they agreed. They knew it was best for Helen. In October, Annie and Helen returned to Perkins. Helen was not enrolled there, she was a guest, but she drove right into the schoolwork. She studied geography, botany, the study of plants, zoology, the study of animals, and arithmetic. Arithmetic was her least favorite subject. Helen's time at Perkins passed quickly. Poetry became her passion. One time Helen visited Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great New England writer. Later she read his poems to the blind children at Perkins. Helen sent him a letter. She told Holmes that she was sorry he had no little children to play with, but that he seemed happy with his many books. She wanted to tell him about what she was learning and asked if her little sister could meet him. When she visited, when she visited Helen. Holmes loved her letter. He published it in an important magazine called the Atlantic Monthly. After this honor, Helen began to take her writing more seriously. In the spring of 1890, a teacher named Mary Swift Lampson returned to Perkins from Norway. While in Norway, she had heard about a deaf-blind girl who had learned to speak. Helen seized upon the idea. Learning to speak became Helen's dream. Annie to realistic tried to be realistic with Helen, for she did not want her to be disappointed. If a person cannot see people's faces, it is extremely hard, almost impossible to learn to speak, but Helen would not give up. Helen did not stand in Annie did not stand in Helen's way. She found a teacher for Helen. Helen had to touch her teacher's mouth as it moved when she spoke. Helen had to learn how lips and tongues move to make words. At the end of the first lesson, Helen could say the letters IMPQS, and Helen had visions of going home and talking with her family. Helen practiced constantly with Annie, but her voice was never clear. It was something that would bother Helen the rest of her life. She felt that not being able to speak clearly made her different. Now 11, Helen wrote a story called The Frost King. She gave the story to Mr. Aganos for his birthday. It was a lovely story full of images and color. It was published in the Memoir that Perkins Alumni magazine in January 1892. People praised the wonderful story. However, Helen had not created the story. A newspaper printed Helen's story side by side with a story by someone called the Frost Fairies. Helen's story was exactly the same. Helen was crushed. Annie said that she had never read the story to Helen. No one ever remembered reading the story to Helen, but a copy of the book was in the house where Annie and Helen stayed on Cape Cod somehow. Helen must have heard the story and forgotten. Helen was shattered. She hadn't been trying to trick anyone. She went to the Perkins School to defend herself. She appeared alone before a group of 8 teachers and school officers. Half of the group was blind and half was sighted. Alone in the hot, stuffy room without Annie, Helen shook with fear. It was like she was on trial for her life. Later Helen wrote, the blood pressed about my driving heart, and I could scarcely speak. The group showed no mercy. Again and again they kept asking, "Who read you that story?" Helen could not answer that question. She had no memory of it. In the end, most of the group believed Helen. Mr. Anagoas thought that it had all been a horrible mistake, but he felt he could no longer trust Helen or Annie. Their, friend, their friendship with Mr. Anagoas ended. Helen's time at Perkins was over. Even worse, Helen was never again sure of her writing. Was she writing from her heart and mind, or repeating something that she had heard? This fear stayed with Helen every time she picked up a pen. Helen and Annie returned to Alabama. Helen was ill most of the summer. She no longer woke up hungry to learn. Helen into retreated into herself, but gradually her spirits grew stronger. Now she had to make a decision. Was her education at an end, or could she find another school? Chapter 7. Years in New York. The door of the Perkins School had slammed shut, but another door opened. Annie learned about a new school for deaf children. Two men, Dr. Thomas Humanson and John Wright, started the school in 1894 in New York City, and it sounded perfect for Helen. But how would the Kellers pay for it? Helen's father had fallen on hard times. There was no money to spare. Fortunately, Helen had met many rich people such as Dr. Bell, John D. Rockefeller, and John Spaulding. Spaulding offered to pay for Helen's schooling, so Annie and Helen left for New York. They settled into a fine house close to Central Park at the Wright-Humpson School. Helen studied arithmetic, still her least favorite subject, English literature, which she loved, American history, French, and German. She also studied lip reading and speech. Helen's fame spread. A reporter from the New York Times came to interview her. He thought he would meet a quiet, shy girl, but 15-year-old Helen amazed him. Throughout the interview, Helen laughed, joked, and flirted. Helen and her class visited the Statue of Liberty. She climbed to the top. To Helen, the air at the top smelled cleaner. The smell of the ocean reminded her of Cape Cod. Another time, Helen's class went to a dog show at Madison Square Garden. Helen loved it because dogs were her favorite animals. One trip affected Helen greatly. Annie and Helen went to the Lower East Side. This is where many new immigrants lived. They lived in tiny, crowded apartments and buildings called tenements. As many as 10 people lived in one small, dark room. Helen could not see the poverty, but she could feel it. The people's clothes felt rough and ragged as they brushed Helen and Annie in the streets. Helen also smelled the machine oil, the sawdust, the street dirt, and the salted fish. She could tell just how different life here was from her. Many famous people lived in New York. At a party, Helen met Mark Twain. Twain had written The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Twain watched Helen read lips. They talked together at the party. When Helen left, she put violets in his buttonholes. The two became lifelong friends. After school, Helen liked going to Central Park on winter days. Helen went bobsledding. She took riding lessons. Helen was growing up. She was becoming a beautiful, interesting young woman. Well, that was chapter 6 and 8. I think we got like 2 more chapters left, maybe 3. So I will try to get that up. It is thundering here. So I don't know when I will be able to get that one up. Hopefully I will be able to get it up later on tonight. So I hope you like this like the story so far of Helen Keller. Please hit like and subscribe to my channel. Please hit the notification bell so you know when I come up with another new video. And I hope the rest of your Monday is good. Talk to you later.